Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the summer session of SA 106, Recognizing and Serving Twice Exceptional Learners. My name is Sarah Jackson. I am going to be your lead teacher for this very fast-paced summer session. Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Hannah Vicent. I teach at Julius West Middle School. I'm going to be co-teaching along with Sarah.
Very excited. Hannah wants to help offer this class more frequently to people across the county, and we're really excited. We've had about 300 teachers or so take all or most of this class in the last 2 years, and I'm really excited to be able to offer more sections, and I'm excited you guys are here this summer. So in a typical semester, we offer this class 2 hours a week over the course of 7 or 8 weeks. But what we have found for the summertime is it works a lot better to compact that down to the month of July. When it comes to the work for for the class, you have until August 2nd to submit that, which is a week after our live sessions end. If you do need more time, always feel free to reach out to us and just kind of give us a heads up. We do need to get all the grades finalized no later than August 16th because people need them for sort of looking for recertification and things like that. So we do want to try and keep to that timeline as much as we can. This evening, we're going to go over logistics as well as content. And one thing we'll definitely do is walk you guys through parts of the Canvas course. I will say that Hannah and I decided to revamp a lot of the course, within the last week or so, because that's what Twice Exceptional people do. You have the treat of having Twice Exceptional teachers teach you about Twice Exceptional children, so have it for what it is worth. So as we are revamping that and hopefully streamlining things, making them a little clearer for you, they are going to come up a little more slowly. The course is set so that you don't have to do anything in any particular order. We will lecture in the order that the modules talk about, but whatever order you guys get the work done in is fine. Just get it done by the second. And I think, Hannah, if you want to go ahead and talk about what your activator is. And
Sure. Let me just have the right tab open here. So we have about 60 people registered to take this course, but it was still important to us that we got to know what you are hoping to get out of the class and what you already know and what your interests are as people, not just teachers. So we have put together an activator, and I already see a bunch of you on it, so thank you for that, where we would like you to share with us, here it is, your workplace, your knowledge or interest in 2E learners. It's okay if you don't know anything yet, just tell us what you're interested in learning, and a fun fact about you. So I don't know, Sarah, did you want to go over what you wrote and put on your slide, and then I can share mine?
sure. The slides went away.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, so like I already said, I'm Sarah Jackson, and not only am I our Twice Exceptional Instructional Specialist, so I kind of oversee everything to do with twice exceptionality in Montgomery County Public Schools, but I am also a twice exceptional learner. I have ADHD along with a whole bunch of other diagnoses, but I was identified as both gifted and having ADHD way back in the 80s, very unusual for a girl back then. And it has kind of framed my entire life. And when I say kind of framed, I mean it is the basis of everything that I do. And I actually will share an essay with you at some point about my experience and why I got into the work that I do. I also have a twice exceptional husband and a twice exceptional child. And if you believe what they say about cats, I'm pretty sure I have twice exceptional cats as well. And being being that like kind of weird, quirky, twice exceptional girl is a large part of my identity, which is what I have kind of up on the screen here. And then just the fun fact about the cats, and that is 5 of the 7 cats that allowed those raccoons into my house. Is a long story. I have video, but I just thought everybody would appreciate meeting the raccoons who stole my biscotti.
There. I am, whoops, I am autistic. I teach 6th, 7th grade English at Julius West Middle School. I was identified as being gifted long before I was identified as being autistic. And the diagnosis of girls in particular is something we will talk about in this course. My fun fact is that I've ridden in a hot air balloon, which was a blast. I highly recommend it. And I really love to read. This is my pie chart of books so far this year. I keep a lot of data on reading, and I've read 46 books so far this year, but I hope to surpass that later in the year. So each of you has a slideshow. My computer's being super slow today. I apologize. With your name on it. They are alphabetical by last name. You are welcome to include whatever information you want us to know about you on your slide. And we'll give you 8 minutes, Sarah. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good. And I think what so Hannah, what I'm kind of thinking is we'll keep, have this up in the background for people to continue to add to. And then, we do a 10-minute break in the middle of the class for health and safety. And if people want to share stuff at that time, that would probably be a good thing. But otherwise, I really do encourage you guys to scroll through here, because even just in the few minutes we've been doing this, it's been fun. Jamie, I have to know, are all those your cats, or is that just I Love Cats picture?
Those are all of our cats lined up.
I feel so much better when somebody else has that many cats too.
Same. You're the first person I've met who has
All
this
of them.
many. Otherwise, it's more or way less.
I really have the need to like sneak over to your house and steal cats because they look gorgeous even from the back sides. All right,
Oh,
I'm going to focus back on the class now. So thank you guys so much for sharing that information. And like Anna said, with 60 people in the class, even though I know there's not 60 people online right now, we will have people, throughout the summer. And I know with summer, if you didn't see in my announcement, we do record all of these classes, and I will post them on my YouTube channel and then link them back into our Canvas classroom. And when we do that, if you do have to miss a class, you're welcome to go back and watch. I also have a number of guest speakers from previous classes. So if you don't feel like listening to us talk for 2 hours, you're welcome to go watch a guest speaker. Some of the guest speakers are going to be repeats to us this year, and I will try and get a list of our guest speakers out so that you don't double yourself up. Because as much as I love our guest speakers, you don't need to hear them much on the same thing twice in a row. Or sometimes you do. Sometimes the information sounds different and it's interesting, but not necessarily 2 weeks in a row. So speaking of, I do want to do a quick run through our Canvas course. Like I said, we are working on prettying it up a little bit and making it a little more functional. And now my screen too is over there. Okay. So this is what our course should look like. The big purple tile, and this is the same tile that should be on your dashboard page. So if you don't see that, let me know. But otherwise, everyone should see this. And when you click on, we've tried to kind of keep it, again, streamlined. So everything we're going to talk about during session 1 is under session 1. The Zoom link for the whole semester month is here. The attendance link is also here. So if you do make up a class, go ahead and click on that attendance link. Let us know which class you're making up and when you're making it up. I do have to submit attendance at the end of this, and you do have to attend, I think it's 12 of the 14 hours or something to that effect in order to get credit. So just make sure you keep up with the attendance. The final project is going to click here. We're going to talk about that a little bit later in our session. And we're making some adjustments because, again, it's summertime. And so I don't expect you to necessarily be able to do some of the activities that we have because it's summertime and you don't have live students in front of you, and that is quite okay. We also have a special project that you're welcome to join. But again, we'll talk about that as well a little bit later. And then as you go into the modules, and we also would love feedback at some point on how they're working for you, what you'll see is we have objectives, we have readings, we have videos. The topics themselves are what we're going to talk about during our live class. But when you go back to do some of the independent work, that's your opportunity to do some more deep dives. So have a chance to watch some of the videos, have a chance to read some of the actual articles. There's way more information on this site than you will ever have a time to read, and that is okay. Part of the way that we approach the learning opportunities in the classroom is pick what sounds interesting to you and read it, because if it doesn't sound interesting, you're not going to read it anyway. So we give you a lot of opportunities to learn information in different ways. So we have videos, we have podcasts. I've had several people who go down the deep dive on the neurodiversity podcast, which is great. They're 30-minute chunks with a lot of researchers. Several of the researchers are going to actually be in our class to speak to us live, which is cool. So definitely, take advantage of the information that's there. But at no point do I expect that you actually read every article or watch every video. Just as you're learning and as you're answering and asking questions, finding those pieces that are interesting for you is really going to be the way to go about that. Do I have anything else? Oh, at this point, all of the work to do on here is discussion boards. And the discussion boards are really for mostly reflection and for you guys to have a chance to kind of chat back and forth with each other. My grading system is 2 points. You either did it, you kind of did it, or you didn't do it. You will get out of this class what you put into it. And so my request is just that just do it. I will sometimes, Hannah or I will respond to people's questions, or we'll provide feedback as much as we can. I just had 90 people take the class in the spring, and 90 people is a lot to respond to, but 60 is pretty manageable. So it will be a little bit on the slower side, but like I said, just being engaged with everybody on the Canvas page is great. And I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with our first kind of topic, which is that real introduction to what is twice exceptional. And I know for what we have, we have some of you guys who are working on twice exceptional projects with me. We have some of you who are in schools that have our twice exceptional program. And we have some of you guys who need three CPD credits, and you could do it in 4 weeks. And I appreciate that, because we're glad you're here for whatever reason you came. And a lot of times the feedback that I get from people who are here because they want the 3 credits is, wow, that was actually a useful class. I just thought we were going to sit here for a couple weeks and get credits, but I actually learned something. So that's my general goal in life, is like get something out of this class. And so that said, as we talk about what is twice exceptional, we are going to definitely be talking about a lot of really current research. Traditionally in MCPS, we've always said that a twice exceptional learner is a student who is identified as gifted and then also has an IEP or a 504. And that is still a pretty manageable definition, but it's not the most accurate definition. And it also doesn't cover what those students need that makes them different, because twice exceptional learners aren't just gifted kids and kids with disabilities at the same time, but they are kids who have entirely different learning profiles. They have different needs. They have more in common with each other and with gifted kids than they do with typical kids, or kids with disabilities. And so that often puts them in a really kind of weird spot in life, because it's hard for them to relate to anybody, but then their peer groups are also groups that tend to have trouble relating to each other. So then they really have trouble relating to each other, and relating to the world around them, which leads to unique social emotional needs. It leads to unique academic needs, and it leads to unique social pieces as well. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my first little fun slideshow. And this is actually the notes that I have posted for the class. So I'm going to talk through these. And when you see them in the classroom, you'll be like, oh, she already talked about that. And that is accurate. I already talked about it. And now I'm also moving your faces over here, so I'm talking to faces and not the glowing red light, because light makes me anxious. You'll also hear a whole lot of me giving side commentary along the way, because that's how my brain functions, and I'd apologize for it, but it wouldn't be a real apology. I would just say I'm sorry. So what is twice exceptional? There we go. So like pretty much everything with twice exceptional, all of my answers are layered, nuanced, and have a whole lot of words. Like I said, the definition, the working definition we've used in Montgomery County for a long time is gifted with a 504 and IEP. That's one sentence. That's not nearly enough for us in twice exceptional land. I really love that we've had so much research come out, especially in the last 4 years, about really redefining what it means to be twice exceptional and who twice exceptional is. So my personal favorite definition is actually Scott Barry Kaufman's definition of twice exceptional. I have truncated it here because, again, all twice exceptional people just seem to talk too much. Sorry about that. Actually, that's not true, but ones like me do. Scott has a really interesting background in history. Scott was actually identified as being cognitively impaired when he was in school. He was blocked from taking AP classes in high school because his IQ wasn't high enough. Those are things that have changed in the years since then. And because of his cognitive profile, he was not able to get into the psychology program at Carnegie Mellon like he wanted to. So he did what anybody else would do, and he learned to sing opera, and he got into the music program at Carnegie Mellon. And then once you get in, you can change majors to whatever you want. And so he eventually changed over to a psychology major. And he has since gotten his PhD from Yale in psychology, and he is developing new theories on human intelligence. That is actually a very kind of typical twice exceptional story and twice exceptional learner, where he has very impaired in auditory processing. He has impairments with reading, but his thoughts obviously are brilliant. And I do think I have some videos of him talking about his new theories around intelligence. So he's definitely a speaker where you get the personal connection as well as the research connection. And so when he talks about twice exceptional, we talk about these exceptional levels of capacity and competence, commitment, creativity, all of these different domains where the person is truly exceptional and in that top, percentile, whatever population it is that you're looking at. But then you are also combined with learning difficulties. And I do appreciate that he talks about learning difficulties and not disabilities. One reason I think it's really important is because, and this is where we get back to that IEP 504 thing, you can have a learning difficulty, you can have a learning impact that doesn't require you to have paperwork to go with it. I mean, I never had a 504 IEP. I really should have, but that's another story for another day. But I never did. That didn't mean I wasn't twice exceptional. It didn't mean I didn't have these needs. It just meant that I didn't have a piece of paper to go with them. And so when we think about who we're serving in twice exceptional land, we want to remember that our students are not always beautifully labeled and called out. We don't get a twice exceptional flag on our profile, and we don't always get identified as gifted and having one of those other documents. So I can't even pull a quick list and tell you who is twice exceptional in our county, except by estimation. So when we're talking about these profiles, we're really looking at the individual students and what their needs are. We'll talk about masking in a few minutes because that's what he's talking about with like hiding disabilities or hiding giftedness. But to me, it also comes down to when we talk about twice exceptional students, it also is a lot about what they need. So they need specialized identification. What we use to identify kids with learning disabilities when we look at IEPs or 504s isn't quite enough. And it's not that the testing or assessments are enough, it's the interpretation that needs to be different. You need teams, you need psychologists who understand what these different profiles look like, what these spiky profiles look like, or what these discrepant profiles look like. And you really need the opportunity to dig into some of the data that we get that might otherwise be summarized, or we look at averages instead of specific subtest scores. So we need somebody who understands how to identify our students. We need to recognize that the commonality that all of our twice exceptional kids have is that need for different learning opportunities. And they need the opportunity to not just develop strengths and interests, because that's true of all kids. All kids, they're not going to pay attention if they're not interested. Some of them are better behaved and will fake it better than others. But if they're not interested, they're not as absorbed. The difference with twice exceptional students and truly with gifted students as well is that their brains they absorb all of this information. They make all of these weird, crazy connections, and sometimes connections that have a depth that even as adults, we struggle to anticipate and struggle to even understand sometimes. But if we don't give them those opportunities to explore those connections and then connect it back to reality or back to instruction, we're losing a lot of they're going to lose a lot of their ability. One thing we do know about gifted and twice exceptional students is they have their brains are more plastic is the word I'm going to use, more pliable than a typical developing brain. They make deeper connections, they make more frequent connections, and they are able to be in that curious and phase longer than a typical person is. But they also lose connections and lose neurons at a faster rate than their typically performing peers. And part of that is because we're not the best, not necessarily as a school system, but as people, in really being able to tap into that potential and support the students in continuing to grow and continuing to keep those connections. And so when the students aren't challenged and we're not meeting those, the gifted side of their brain, they're actually going to lose skills and lose some of that plasticity faster than a typically performing student would. And we will talk throughout this about some of the differences with gifted and twice exceptional. We'll talk about the differences with advanced learners versus gifted as well as we go through some of these characteristics. And then the last piece is that simultaneous support, and that is going to be the bulk of what we talk about in class. This definition follows very similarly to what Scott Berghoffman's talking about. I think he was actually on the group that helped write this definition. This is the Council for Exceptional Children, which is the professional organization for special educators. And there is a subgroup of that of the Association for the Gifted. And that's where twice exceptionality will fall in the world of CEC. And so CEC rewrote this definition back in, I want to say it was 2019, and then they reaffirmed it and updated it in 2020. Again, it talks a lot about, that masking piece. It talks about the duality of who these students are. It talks about that need for instruction. And then we come back into those support services as well. And what I really like in this definition is that they really focus on, in the support, around the social emotional well-being and some of those therapeutic interventions. We do not do therapy in school. I know that. And that, again, is kind of that whole big picture of twice exceptional versus what we can do within the school system. You might need therapeutic intervention and still be twice exceptional, and that's not something we can serve in the school system, but that doesn't make you not twice exceptional. It doesn't mean you don't need some of the other things that are out there. So when we kind of think about all of the nuances that make up these students, we have to remember that they're twice exceptional all the time. And that means at home, that means in their family life. There can be a lot of significant impact on family life. And we can't, with any kid, we can't necessarily address all this in the school system, but it is a part of the profile, and it is something that we need to know when we're working with these kids. And then that last piece, that working with this population requires specialized training and specialized professional development. One thing that the National Association for Gifted Children tells us, and that is the professional equivalent of CEC for the rest of us. We know that just being aware of these students and aware of what their social emotional needs are, and that their social emotional needs are different than typical students, goes a long way towards more positive outcomes and more positive emotional growth for our students. Because part of being twice exceptional is always kind of feeling like you don't fit. And if you have adults in your life who don't understand that you're pretty much constantly feeling this way, it's a hard thing to explain, especially when you are a kid. But if you are working with adults who are like, in their head, they're like, this is going to be different. They're going to struggle with some of these things. And then they make some of those supports and allowances going into any situation, then we're going to be able to better address their needs just by making the space more comfortable for them and making their ability to have relationships with us as adults more comfortable. I'm going to do a quick run through about COMAR, that's NCAA Code of Maryland. We are not specifically spelled out as twice exceptional in there, but we are recognized, and some of the information that is in here about gifted is also important to us as a twice exceptional population. The person who was the head of gifted ed for Maryland at the time that this was written is also twice exceptional. It's something he shares. He actually had very severe dyslexia and was told he would never graduate high school, but he ended up with a PhD in educational psychology and in educational psychology and special education. He ran gifted ed for Howard County, and then he ran gifted ed for the state of Maryland for like a decade, I want to say. So again, another somewhat typical twice exceptional story about some of the challenges and barriers that our students are facing. So we have it that, you know, that gifted occurs in across all groups, across all populations of people. The same is true in twice exceptionality. There's a lot of belief, and some of that is just because of the way things have kind of come out over the years, that most twice exceptional people are white males. And part of that problem is that what research shows us is that if you have two identical students with identical profiles and one student is a Black male and one student is a white male, the white male is more likely to be identified as twice exceptional and have access to twice exceptional services and gifted services, and the African American male is more likely to be coded with an emotional disability and be kind of funneled into some of the emotional disabilities programs. It's information that we know. It's information that I know our school psychologists and MCPS are becoming more and more aware of. It's not that they're not aware of the disparity, but that specific piece around twice exceptionality has been an amazing talking point with a lot of our psychologists and those teams. But it's something that's important to know because it does color sometimes people's belief about both gifted and twice exceptional when we're talking about these populations, because the population that is most identified is not it is not who our population actually is. So some of the things that have helped us in Maryland and in MCPS is we have changed the approach on how we look at gifted identification. We've changed, we've always had a somewhat universal screening for gifted ed, or we have for quite a while. Things that we have done differently in Montgomery County that I think are really important, besides the multiple indicators piece and our universal screening, which we've expanded, we now screen students in grade 2, 3, 5, and 7. That might change, but that's what it is right now. The identification pool is the important piece for me. This is something that I have fought hard for over the last couple of years, and we finally were able to, like everything else, you know, bureaucracies take forever. This year, we were finally able to make a change that students are no longer excluded because of special education programs that they're in, but rather if a student's family has signed off on alternative learning outcomes, meaning that they are on the certificate bound track, those students are excluded because there has to be an acknowledgement of a cognitive disability in order to be in that pathway. I'm really super summarizing that. I'm sure the ALO people could tell you way better than I can, but essentially they've signed off that their students are not diploma bound. And so because of that designation, those students are not screened. But if a family has not agreed to ALO, or if a student is not on receiving ALO services, they are screened for gifted education or for gifted identification. And I think it's a huge change because we have found students over time who maybe they weren't there yet, or something was going on in their life and they were first receiving special education services, and being given those services and having a chance to develop and get older over time, some of them have really blossomed, and we've been able to identify kids at those later grades, at grade 5, grade 7, who may have been never screened or excluded from screening previously. And that is no longer how that system is set up. So that has actually been a really big change over the last couple of years with our looking at giftedness in MCPS. The part about documenting advanced learning behaviors, this really, to me, and especially in our county right now, speaks more towards what our IEP and 504 teams are doing. Because sometimes we're identifying kids as twice exceptional. They don't have the scores, if you will, to identify them as gifted. But that doesn't mean that they're not twice exceptional, because we know that sometimes those profiles, you know, they mask each other, and so we don't necessarily see that. But it's important that IEP teams and 504 teams know about these students, because we can still address their needs. Just like labels don't drive special education services, labels don't drive advanced learning opportunities either. And so if teams know what it is that we're looking for, we can document those into 504s and IEPs and make sure our students are getting what they need. It doesn't help me in terms of it, pulling numbers out of the hat and telling you how many kids we have with a profile, but it helps the kids, and that's the important part. We talk about traditionally underrepresented students. We have a whole session on that, and we will integrate talking about those profiles as we go through our learning. Those are that. This again talks about professional learning. Mostly I highlighted those, so when you guys, if you want to go back and look at that, the stuff in orange is the stuff that I find the most important in our laws. We do actually have gifted and talented certification for teachers. It's a specialist endorsement, so it's not an initial endorsement. You have to be endorsed in something, but you can get the gifted endorsement as well. And then those are the full COMARs. For all of you who would love to sit there and read COMAR, I've got all the links for you. Switching screens. And feel free to
So Sarah, before we move on to masking, I was sent a question about extreme anxiety in 2E students. And I'm really glad this question was brought up. Generally, when we think about 2E students, there are traditionally 3 and now 4 categories of disability that are considered. We are hoping to broaden that scope to include other disabilities, but the disabilities that are often discussed when people are thinking about twice exceptionality are autism, ADHD, specific learning disability, and now the 4th is anxiety, which we do see in quite a lot of gifted learners, not just in twice exceptional learners. Sarah, do you want to expand?
Yeah, no, I mean, we call them the big 3. And for those of you who are special educators, ADHD is not a disability code. It's part of the other health impairment code. But we know that when we're talking twice exceptional OHI, we're really talking about ADHD. And the same with anxiety. Anxiety will sometimes fall under other health impairments. More often and more, I think, accurately, it falls under emotional disability. Across the board, post-pandemic, we know that that has been the biggest increase in diagnoses for everybody. But when it comes to our twice exceptional kids and our gifted students, I think a lot of the reason of the increase in that, and then in that identification part, has been recognizing it for what it is. I think there's things that may have been called school refusal, or may have been called avoidance behaviors, or may have been called problematic behaviors previously. As we are delving more and more into meeting the mental health needs of students, and as that becomes yet another thing we get to do in public schools, I think we're really also kind of starting to see how those are impacting our gifted and our twice exceptional students, and frequently how often our gifted students are getting that twice exceptional label because of that anxiety piece. One of the things that we will talk about actually as part of the next topic is this idea of misdiagnosis and missed diagnosis. And then another piece of that is also, and it's a little bit part of the misdiagnosis piece, which is really trying to understand the difference between a gifted kid with anxiety and a twice exceptional kid with anxiety. And there is a difference. Some of it has to do with pervasiveness over time. Some of it has to do with intensity. Some of it has to do with maladaptive behaviors. And some of it has to do with interpretation. I think there's plenty of times we could have a gifted kid who has anxiety and it's a problem and we need to work on it. And then we have a twice exceptional kid who has anxiety to the point that they require specialized instruction. They require support through the school system, through our IEP process. I know we have at least one person from Magruder, and I think we have one person also from Sherwood, maybe. And I say those because that's where our enhanced SESES programs are. So for those of you who don't know, those are our social emotional support programs for students, and they're called enhanced because the primary profile of students in there are students who are very internalizing. They are very, they're very internalizing. They're very, I won't say the word that came to mind is self-destructive, and that's not the word I want. So, but of course, that's the word that won't go away now. But they're just, it's hard for them to get themselves to school. It's hard that there often have been hospitalizations. The anxiety is truly crippling. The last I did a run on the numbers with those two programs, we were running about 50% of kids who were identified as gifted who also had IEPs in those programs. So anxiety is a huge piece of this. I say if I want to go into topic 2, or if I want to pull up my article. No, I'm going to go through topic 2 first. I'm going to go through topic 2 first, and then I'm going to bring us an article, or I'll pop an article in if you guys want to read it during our break. But I will go over it. And it talks actually specifically around not only giftedness and anxiety, but around a little bit about perfectionism and just other very kind of typical profile things that we see with gifted kids that we just see amplified with our twice exceptional kids. And I do please keep putting questions in the chat. Also feel free to tell me to slow down or repeat. Like, I'm never offended if people, I know I talk too fast. I've got way more than 14 hours worth of thoughts in my head, and I've tried to get them out there to you guys, but please tell me slow down or things if we need that. And like I said, that's bringing us into the topic 2, which is kind of how do we get to find these twice exceptional learners? What is it that we're looking for? What are we not looking for? And a little bit also on like why it matters. So masking is literally what it sounds like. It is putting a mask in front of something to block or hide something else. So when we talk about our twice exceptional students and their masking, we're really usually talking about one of 3 broad forms. And the first one is our student who is very gifted, and they are in fact so, I'm going to say look so gifted, whether it's on paper or in presentation, that we miss the fact that they have disabilities. One of the best examples of this is something that's called stealth dyslexia. And stealth dyslexia is when we have a student who is such a strong contextual reader that they can, generally speaking, they can read most of what's on a page. They're not reading it well, but they can pick up enough context clues from what they are reading that they can kind of make their way through what it is that they're reading. It generally starts to become a noticeable or a problem as we get into late middle school and high school, and then also in college, because we're getting into more and more complex vocabulary where the students don't necessarily know enough of the context around to figure out the words that they don't know, because there's more and more words that they don't know. The more a kid reads, the longer they can make that stealth dyslexia piece hide. One of the best ways actually to address it is instruction through Greek and Latin roots, because again, those give you such context clues that if you can pick up where those roots are, you can kind of start to figure out words even if you're not decoding properly. The other thing it will start to look like often, especially if the disability hasn't been noticed, is that there's students who, they should be doing better. We expect a little bit more from them, but we're not getting that. What we're getting is what we might look at as underachievement. These are frequently our kids who get called lazy. Oh, they could do it, they just won't. It's not that they won't, it's often that they can't, but they don't know how to express that they can't. And because the disability isn't clear, it's hard to see why they're not doing what they're doing. This can be a real source of frustration for students, and this also can be a piece of some of the perfectionism as well, where they can't get themselves to do what it is that they want to do, so they just don't do it at all. It doesn't look like they think it should look. It doesn't do what they think it should do, so they just don't. And that becomes a pattern of underachievement and leads to things like the poor self-concept. The second one is probably the one that we think of more often when we think of twice exceptional, and these are our students whose disability is recognized, but the giftedness is masked. It could look like, suppressed scores on things like intelligence tests. More often than not, it's a kid who's just kind of looking like a hot mess, and then we start testing them, and we get to things like um, the most frequent profile we have are kids whose verbal comprehension scores, whose visual spatial scores, whose fluid reasoning scores are in the 99th plus percentile. And then their working memory and processing speed, so like the how the brain functions, those are down in 100, 80s. And really, if you think 100 is average, and the span of average goes really 90 to 110. Anything outside of that, and we start kind of dipping in other directions. But one thing that I spend a lot of time explaining to teams is 70 is, and Monica, tell me if I get the numbers wrong, but 70 is really kind of that borderline of truly impaired. If you have a student who has an IQ score of 100 and one of their areas is in the 70s, that's heading into truly impaired land. If I have a student whose IQ is 130 and their processing speed is 100, that's the same difference as 100 to 70. Now, mathematically, you're sitting here telling me, yes, clearly. But what that implication is, what that means in working life is that part of this kid's brain is running on an engine, it's running with the gas pedal being stood on, and part of their brain, they're slammed on the brakes. And they're not working together very easily. And so sometimes what this will look like is underachievement. Sometimes what this will look like is refusal. Sometimes it will look like they're ignoring you when really they kind of heard what you said, but they're still processing it out and they're trying to come up with what their next step is. But they're moving at such a slower pace compared to the other parts of their brain. It looks like they're not doing anything at all. We also will see things like students with severe specific learning disabilities. I have a couple of students. I have one student right now. He may have graduated. I might not actually have him right now. But the last time we had tested him, he was reading below kindergarten level, just fine. But he was also taking multivariable calculus. And we had to read 2 versions of all of the multivariable calculus books because he couldn't read them. And you reach a point sometimes where you have done so much instruction for a student and they have kind of plateaued where they are that you really focus more on, do I really need to give him another reading intervention in 7th and 8th grade? Or do I need him to take the appropriate math class so that he can go into multivariable calculus when he gets older? The team made that decision that we gave him more electives, more things that he was interested in. And he's been able to travel around the world. He's gotten scholarships to do things in like biodiversity studies. He needed his scuba exam read to him. He needed support for other things. But he's able to navigate the world. We just have to provide him a read to accommodation in multivariable calculus. It's the multivariable calculus I struggle to wrap my brain around a little bit. And that's a support that he's going to need throughout the rest of his life. If we only focused on where his reading needs were and we hadn't done cognitive testing, if we hadn't recognized some of those other pieces, that would be a case where you might say the reading is so impacted we can't really do anything else, and we don't want to fall down in that trap. And then I will try and find some example scores. I used to show some of them, but because I'm recording this and I put it up on YouTube, I don't want to have, I don't do a great job of making sure everything's blocked out for specific students. But actually, Hannah do you want to talk about your profile a little bit?
Sure. I don't have much else to say other than what I put in the chat, but I have a very high verbal, it's in the extremely high range. My verbal IQ 157, the average is 100, but my visual spatial IQ is 83. So what that means is that I have a large gap between my ability to reason with words and language and my ability to reason with space and time. So what that might look like in the classroom setting is a kid who is clumsy or who doesn't understand visual directions, who struggles with science experiments, with directions, with maps, with locations, who can't find their classroom the third week of school, but who can read Shakespeare in fifth grade. And the challenge for twice exceptional students is that because these areas are so deep in their division, is that they might, one, feel a sense of disparagement or even embarrassment or shame that, you know, I'm smarter than this. I know I can do better, but I don't know how. Amy, do you have a question?
Sorry, real quick. I don't know if anyone else is wondering this or I'm the only one that's below on this, but when you say 100 is an average IQ, isn't it something deeper? Like, what does the 100 represent? Is it out of, especially like with children, like a third grader, is it out of 100 third graders within, like, what are the specifics of the scores?
You're asking if it's norm referenced?
Yeah.
It's norm-based, and Monica, please feel free to jump in. Monica's my resident psychologist right now.
Sorry if you guys all understand this, you can just
No,
email me later.
No,
I'm so
thank you for
sorry.
asking.
Yeah, I was gonna say, a lot of times we talk about these things and forget that not everybody here has sat through 100 IEP meetings this year and talked about it 100 times. But yeah, so when we talk about the average, we're talking about an age-based average. So it's all norm reference based on other people their age. So whatever age Hannah was when she did her testing, that would be referenced against other people who were about that age. I can definitely grab that bell curve piece. Let me stop sharing because I cannot type and talk at the same time, especially if I think people are looking. And I think this will also be a little bit helpful as to why looking at these scores are not always it can't be the end all and the be all. There we go, some Shakespeare references for everybody. So when we're talking about this, ooh, come on, there you go. Trying to make it bigger. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, it's good, Sarah.
Okay. So when we're talking about these norm references, and it is based on age, average is what's falling in this blue zone on here. This is where the vast majority of people fall. And the little numbers, if you can see on the screen, it's basically like 68% of people fall in that average range, with 34% on either side of 100. 95% of people fall within the next standard deviation, so that's that 70 to 130 range. When we talk about it in terms of special education, other things, we break up those even more to talk about them. But that's putting us out into some of those extremes. So what Hannah's talking about with her scores, if you see all the way out here in this little yellow range, it's 0.1%. So 0.1% of people's scores fall here. She's beyond this. For her verbal score. Her verbal score is not on this chart, literally. But her visual spatial score is, and her visual spatial score is all the way over here, where only 14%-ish of people would fall. Monica?
No, I was just gonna say that typically how we as psychologists describe it, exactly what you guys are saying, the 2 standard deviations below. So the green area are the 2 standard deviations. So essentially our kids that are gifted or twice exceptional, we go on the right side of the green side, they're already hitting that threshold of the 2 standard deviations above the mean, which the mean is 100. So that's like the average. As we typically 100, but usually 90 to 109 is our kind of our range that we go through. And like what Sarah says, 70 or below is typically our kind of red flag of where like, okay, things are not, we need to do some more investigation of their IQ.
And then when we're talking about some of these differences and discrepancies, like I said, if we have somebody whose IQ is 130 in one area and 80 in another area, that's the same as being 170 in terms of their individual discrepancy. So Hannah, you're like the perfect example of this, because we're talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 standard deviation difference, which is, I don't know how to express the level of significance that is in terms of a chart. But it also, I mean, she's a successful teacher. She is successful in a whole lot of different things. I have a resume. I'm not going to go through it, but
Not very good at parking.
I love it.
For those of you who are more verbal, prefer words to numbers. Typically, what you would see on an IEP is if they're in this blue area, the child will be marked as average for that domain. This green one over here, this is what would be considered high average. And then the orange would be very high, and the yellow would be extremely high. And then the reverse for the other side, low average, very low, extremely low.
Thank you. I like how the things just popped up on my screen too. I haven't tried that before.
I don't know how to get rid of them, but I knew that I did draw them. Other questions then about IQ scores?
I figured it out. Awesome. And like I said, I do definitely appreciate. Oh, look, it worked. So excited when things like that work. Sorry, so I had to get myself back to where we were. So, so our last category is when they're masking each other and they end up looking very average. So, this is when we aren't seeing the giftedness, that we're not seeing the disability. Frequently, these are our parents who are also the most frustrated, because they're often trying to explain to us what it is that they're seeing. Because remember, twice exceptional kids are twice exceptional all the time. And we don't always see that whole picture. And sometimes the fallout of what they're dealing with in school happens at home. And so I frequently will have conversations with teams about, I get that the kid's not doing anything in school. They look really typical in school. But if they are working so hard all day long to hold themselves together that they are tearing up their house when they get home at night, is there something we can do at school to help them learn to manage that tension during the day, learn to do some of these things during the day, or trust somebody during the day to share their frustration, that it brings down the temperature at home? Because if their whole day is impacted by everything that happens at school, it kind of is a school thing, even if they're not blowing up on us. Sometimes that looks like a response to an intervention, and that intervention is not an IEP, but it's giving them some more tools during the day, pulling them into social groups, looking for some of those areas that won't show up in IQ tests, because as much time as we spend, talking through the IQ test, they're also not everything. We know there's a lot of historical bias with IQ tests. We know that we're trying to work through that in the world of research. We're using a lot of other opportunities to try and find other ways to identify students as gifted or as having needs, but they are still an important part of the conversation. And so if we're having a kid who's masking in this area, but the parents are insisting it's going something on, we kind of feel like maybe there's something going on, it's really worth starting to investigate some of those other areas that we know that twice exceptional kids have needs, to see if we're missing a piece of their puzzle. You guys can watch that video on your own. No,
So every
don't
night
wanna,
at the dinner table
nope.
with my pops, it was Jonathan Stein.
Yep, I know. Jonathan Mooney's fun too, but I don't feel like talking or hearing from him today. Oh, that's my last slide. That's why I can't go any further. So, Jonathan Mooney's another twice exceptional student who really struggled through school, ended up getting, I think, PhD, something along those lines. So it's a good video to watch for sure, because he gives you kind of that example of what it can be like for twice exceptional people outside of school, because all of these issues that we see with the kids during the day do follow them at home, and they do have impact on them when it comes to doing their homework, when it comes to relating to their siblings, when it comes to building social skills and being able to be social outside of kind of a forced school setting. And those are all really important pieces of their puzzle. So it is 8:05. I usually like to give a 10-minute break in the middle of class because we have been sitting for at least an hour, and I don't know, I'm starting to tune myself out. So I assume you all are tuning me out too. So I usually will just hit pause on the recording and say we'll be back at 8:15. We're stopping a little later than I usually do. I'm going to pop that article into the chat. Don't feel the need to read it, but some people are going to want to read it, or they're going to want it after the fact, which is perfectly fine. It's from Matt Zareski. They interviewed Matt Zareski, and I'm a big fan of his. And this is really, the article is how researchers are talking about giftedness being a new kind of way to look at neurodiversity. So the same way that we, when we talk about neurodiversity, differences in the brain, ADHD, specific learning disability, autism all fall on that spectrum of neurodiversity right now. And I've kind of said this for a while, and I'm really glad that, research can prove what we're talking about. Gifted brains are different, and they kind of start to fall under this world of neurodiversity. And so that's kind of where this article is. And it is focused on gifted, not twice exceptional, but I think it kind of goes well with the flavor. Plus, I sent it to the entire special ed leadership for the county. So, you should read what I sent to them. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and hit pause on the video.
Sarah, before we get back into it, Ken asked a really good question in the chat. How can we help beyond the classroom? And I think, this is one of those sticky situations where it's difficult to help kids with things that aren't happening right in front of you. And I think we can divide what we can do into two strategies, instructional and non-instructional. Because the easier and the more, well, I don't want to say easier, the more accessible school is to them, the less stressful it will be. So instructionally, one thing that works for a lot of twice exceptional kids is chunking of tasks so that they don't get overwhelmed or bogged down by that sense of perfectionism. They know they have to do it little by little with regular check-ins along the way. There's not too much to process, and there's not that intensive load on the executive functioning capabilities. The other thing that I would suggest maybe doing in the classroom is being mindful of how you are having students interact socially when it comes to constructing meaning, discourse, and their learning. Some of our kids who are twice exceptional are extremely social, they're funny, they love talking to other kids, but some of them really struggle to make connections with their peers. And that might be because of anxiety or autism, or it could be that they are highly intelligent and so they have difficulty connecting with other children. So it's important to model what is socially appropriate and to help build scaffolds for them to access social opportunities at school as well. In terms of things that are non-instructional, I think, building those relationships with kids to help them understand that you are a safe adult that they can come to, but also with the caregivers who, I sometimes reach out to parents and they say, I don't know what to do with him anymore. And that's not something that is atypical, especially for, I teach middle school, that age group. But I think that sometimes if you are a parent or a caregiver and you do not have the benefit of norming your child against other kids their age, it might be difficult to see what someone else might see. And I wouldn't suggest to a parent that their child has a disability. That's not appropriate if you're not a psychologist, but you might say, hey, have you brought that up to your pediatrician, that your child is really struggling with focus or anxiety or whatever you're noticing in the classroom that they also might be noticing at home. Sarah, do you have other ideas?
I mean, I think that's a really great place. And, part of what we'll do in the course is explore that more deeply. I think the other thing that's important, just because you brought up caregivers, and this has been if you go back and watch on the guest speakers list, Ashley Carpenter, we interviewed her back in April of this year, May of this year. It was one of those months in the spring that all looked the same after a while. But it's something that I'm experiencing right now, which is I'm literally an expert in my field, and I have no idea what to do with my twice exceptional child or how to manage my twice exceptional household. And I was sitting there and I'm looking like right next to me, I've got all the notes from the meeting I just had about my daughter with the psychologist. And like we're talking about a behavior intervention plan. And I'm like that workshop I teach. And yet when we're going through like what we can do around the house, and I'm like, I know, but how do I do it? You know, and some of it is getting me, who also has an executive functioning disability, on board. It's getting my husband, who has executive functioning disabilities, on board. And a lot of times, you know, twice exceptional children do not fall far from twice exceptional trees. And so there's a lot going on in the home. But it also does not matter how much of an expert you are in the field, you're a different kind of expert with your child. And so sometimes there is a bit of frustration just in that I you know, I can make suggestions for what the parents can do, but whether or not they know they can do it, they might not be able to do it. And that comes back to what can I do more in the classroom? And so like I think what you said, like the chunking piece and helping manage that time. If you've had a chance to look at the Matt Zareski article, you know, I think the third thing on his list of things that teachers can do differently is just stop giving homework. I get it, you know, there's policies around it, but especially for gifted and twice exceptional kids, they don't need the extra practice. They're getting it. They need the extra time to finish what they're not getting. And so just anything that you can do to help them manage on the front end so that they don't go home and just melt down because they can't remember any of it. Because that is what happens very frequently with our kids, is like they're there. And when they're in the context of the classroom, everything makes sense because it's their classroom. And I know what I do in math class. And I've got all these math things in my head. And then I take 2 steps outside the math classroom and the context of math is gone. And everything I thought I knew about math is gone. And if I try and test in a different location, dear God, I will never pass the test. But if I test in my usual seat, I'll be fine because the context of the space works for me. And for the kids who, especially when talking secondary, you've gone to 7 different locations throughout the day, and then you went home, and that's 7 different things to totally lose. And so the cumulative frustration around that, and then they take that home to mom and dad. And so again, they may have masked this all day long for us at school, and then they get home and mom and dad have 7 periods of blow up on them at home. And it just it cycles. So communication.
Amen. Amen.
I think those are great things that we can do within the classroom to support things that are going on at home. And I think the only other piece I would add to that is also believing parents. And I say this again with being this parent who I went to the meeting, I have a great relationship with the school team. But I went in, I was telling them about some of the things that are going on in the house, and they're just staring at me. And they're like, it's not that we don't believe you, it's just they're mind boggled. And then my first time all year, first time since she got there, the principal gets called down to her classroom because she knew mommy and daddy were at school for a meeting, and she threw a pencil at the principal. She's never done it. And I threw pencils at everybody all the time, but for her, she'd never done that. And when the principal came back in the room, he's like, if I hadn't just listened to you talk for the last half hour, I never would have believed that was your child in the classroom. I'm like, oh, that child is a child I get home every single day. So it's not unusual to have completely disparate experiences with the same kid, whether you're at home or school or different teachers. And that could be another piece as well, as talking to other teachers in the building about the kid that they see. It's not that they're lying, that they're different, but different contexts can be an entirely different experience for kids. Ms. Foster.
Hi. I was going to share saying that maybe also involving students in the IEP process, having their voice heard and having them give their input. They have special gifts. They might be able to give us information that's not on that test, you know, wherever, and things that might work for them. And that's giving them a sense of empowerment. So when you're doing your FBA or whatever, you know, just whatever it could be, just having them learning that process gives them that skill. So when they do leave home, they take those skills with them.
100%. And actually, that is something that we do as part of our Twice Exceptional program in secondary, is they start going through their IEPs in 6th grade. And when I taught high school primarily with Twice Exceptional, but usually junior year, I made them sit with me while I wrote most of their IEP, and senior year, I made them lead their IEP meetings, because they're going to college or post-secondary or something, and they've got to be able to speak to their abilities and disabilities and their needs. And they have to own it. And that's a big part of being Twice Exceptional, is that metacognitive piece of understanding who you are, why you learn like you do, what you learn like you do. And that I say it sometimes facetiously and sometimes truly, like I still feel completely broken some days. I'm not broken. I know I'm not broken. I'm just a quirky kid with ADHD who's also gifted, and my brain works in a different way. But being in a neurotypical world, you feel broken. And the kids are feeling that. And if we don't tell them that that's normal, and that is just their normal, and they have to approach things in a different way, it starts to internalize and it starts to become destructive, so that by the time we do get them and they're older and they don't have the language around what's going on, there's a lot of breakdown and there's a lot of struggle.
And we have 2 questions in the chat. So the first one is about attendance and Twice Exceptionality. Is that connected?
Not directly. My guess is if you're seeing a connection, more often than not, it's around anxiety. The other one I will sometimes see is again with the ADHD and autism piece, depending on where their social skills are at, they might just be overwhelmed by school life, whatever, and it's their way of taking a break. But my guess is more often than not, and that's mostly experience, I have no data for that, but my experience is the kids who tend to be the school avoiders, whether or not they're Twice Exceptional, but when they're Twice Exceptional, tend to be anxiety based. And if it doesn't look like anxiety, but you're still seeing that poor attendance, then that's what I would say. Look for anxiety that doesn't look like anxiety. So are they a behavior problem when they're in the class? Are they, or do they refuse to do stuff? Do they cop an attitude that they can give you attitude before they can show that they are struggling or they don't know what to do? Kind of trying to keep people at arm's length, and so that either they physically keep people at arm's length, or then they verbally, emotionally keep people at arm's length, so that you can't penetrate in and figure out where the anxiety is coming from. So that would be my first look. And then, as always, I would say, EMT, counselors, psychologists, have them, come in, and even if it's not an actual observation, just kind of a kid chat, around what people are seeing, and see if it's the same in multiple classrooms or your classroom. Because regardless of who you are as a person, the kids might not be comfortable in that setting. It might be the subject, it might be other kids in the class, it might be the physical room itself is too loud, too bright, too noisy, too whatever. So kind of trying to see if there's trends across the day would be an important part of that piece as well. And I think just kind of another piece on there of keeping, you can have a great relationship with a kid and still have a disconnect or some issues in there. Don't take it personally, because it is not unusual for our kids to act out against the people. It's kind of like you fall apart at home because mom and dad are a safe place. Sometimes as a teacher, if you're in a safe place, they are the worst in your class, because they know you're not going to throw them out. And they know that even if they completely mess up today, they can still come back tomorrow. So sometimes it's hard. And I really think more, I used to teach in the Bridge program, which I'm smiling at Carla's screen because Carla used to be there with me and had a bunch of my kids. And it's really hard when you have kids with significant needs in that emotional realm, and they're coming at you. But they're coming at you because they know that you'll still be there for them when they're done. So it's just kind of another piece of the puzzle.
So then the other question we have is, I'm curious about those students who have a medical diagnosis but do not qualify for an IEP or as gifted. So I guess the medical diagnosis I'll talk about first. I assume you're talking about things like epilepsy, diabetes here. Please chime in if that's not what you meant.
Well, I think you can also have a medical diagnosis of ADHD or autism and not have an IEP as well. So I would say it's probably that whole realm.
Students are eligible for an IEP if they have a disability that is under the codes of IDEA and they require specially designed instruction to access the curriculum. So if a child has a disability but does not require specially designed instruction, typically they are then still eligible for a 504. For a 504, you need to have a disability that impacts a major life function. So the definition is much broader. In terms of those children not being identified as gifted, Sarah, you could definitely speak more to this. The testing is only part of the gifted designation, but imagine if they're missing a lot of testing that could impact the designation. Sarah?
So within MCPS at this time, I'm going to try and keep my opinions to myself, but it's not going to go very well. In MCPS at this time, we do not do any cognitive testing in terms of a gifted identification. We use teacher rating scales and parent rating scales, and we use performance data. You can imagine that twice exceptional kids are a big chunk of kids that are left out of that. I could go on for an hour about how we go through our gifted identification process, but ultimately the kids who are most impacted for gifted identification are our EML learners and our twice exceptional learners. We have pathways we're working on for EML right now. We're working really closely with DELMI, which stands for something about English language learners. There's so many acronyms at central office and I forget them and they change every other day anyway. But we're working with them on alternate data that we can use to address language growth in students in order to better identify EML learners. But when it comes to our twice exceptional kids, the only pathway we have right now is through that collection of testing that happens during the IEP process. So there are things that we can do, and it isn't just the IQ score. Thank you, Hannah. She put it out what it all stands for. I'm just really glad I know where their office is in the building. But yeah, so at any rate, we're working on it. But right now, one thing I tell teams all the time, and whether you're general ed, special ed, you're going to get in a meeting at some point, so share the knowledge. We can identify kids as gifted when we have their cognitive scores in those psych reports that our school psychs do that parents bring in. And if we have a report that is certified by the school team or accepted by the school team that says the kid is gifted, we can accept that at central office. There's a process to go through because there's a process for everything. The thing is, for elementary and middle school, either your GT liaison or your AEIST has to be part of that process because they're the ones who have the magical link to send that up to my office. And then when it gets to my office, especially if we're talking a psych report, 99% of the time it ends up on my desk. I look at it, I go, yeah, I know the team. Yes, I know the report. I'm agreeing with their assessment, or yes, they've done their assessment. It doesn't matter whether I actually agree with it. I'm really just assessing that we've gone through the appropriate processes to accept the report. And then we can, I'm gonna go with magically flip a switch in the system. But that's a lot of people who have to be in the know. We are doing that training constantly, but you know, I can tell the GT liaison for an elementary school this, but unless the GT liaison's at the IEP meeting, they are not going to get that information. We're working really hard to tell the school psychologists, but school psychologists, you know, they've got caseloads of 400 or 500 kids. So helping them make those connections with the GT liaisons in the 3 and 4 and 5 schools that they're attached to, things will fall through the cracks. So a lot of it is just the more information is out there and the more people know, the better we can do with identifying those students. And the better we can do with making people aware that they exist and then providing the services and supports that they need after they get there. And it doesn't matter if the kids have a 504 and IEP. It also doesn't matter if you have a meeting and you decide they don't qualify for anything, but you have a psych report that says they're gifted. You can send that up to our office as well. And it's the same link for all the grade levels. And if you ever need that link, you can ask me. I'm sure I have it somewhere. And then we also will direct you to the person in school who has to fill out the magic link. I use a lot of facetious terms like magic link and magic buttons. It's not actually magic. It's just time-consuming technology, but those pathways do exist. And they even exist in a cute little graphic organizer, which I know because I made, because you'll see very frequently, and things are beautiful. It's probably because I had something else I was supposed to be doing. So I spent a lot of time making a graphic organizer or something along those lines. So the pathways to GT identification are beautiful. So, excellent. So we've talked about a couple things that I'm going to do a little bit of directing because they're in the course and the people who are talking about them can say it much better than I do. So I'm going to kind of give you some context so that when you go into the different podcast options, you kind of have context. That was repetitive. The first thing we have on here, one thing I is not frequent that I ask everybody to do something, but one of the podcasts I ask everyone to listen to is the one on the case for differential diagnosis. And this, I really like Dr. Hassler's take on this because the idea really is when we go into an IEP meeting or a child find meeting, we're going in because somebody has noticed a problem and we are trying to diagnose the problem. What Dr. Hassler points out is if we go in looking for dyslexia, we're either going to find dyslexia or we're not going to find dyslexia. But if we go in and say there's a concern and let's explore, it's almost like exploratory surgery, right? Like let's go in and explore what's going on and see what we come up with. We aren't limiting ourselves to looking for what we think the problem is. Now, on the flip side, as I just said, we have what, 40 school psychologists? I think we have like 100, but we have way more kids who have those needs than we have school psychologists to be available to do that. There's a lot of testing, which is why we have diagnostic questions we come up with during a meeting. And that's where we kind of teeter on that edge of, if I'm looking for dyslexia and I find dyslexia, am I going to look for anything else? Or am I going to say this is clearly the problem? And I'm using dyslexia because that's my example at the moment. You know, if we think ADHD, are we going to look for dyslexia? If we think that there's extreme behavior issues and we're thinking more of an emotional disability, are we stopping to say, wait, maybe the child is just really frustrated because it is actually dyslexia, but we're just seeing the behaviors and we're not testing for a specific learning disability because that's not what we think we're seeing in the classroom. And so when we talk about this differential diagnosis idea, I recognize she is coming from a private setting, and in private setting, you can pay for whatever you want. But I think the theory behind it is really important, and hearing how she kind of talks through the whys of why we might want to approach these conversations in a different manner, I think is really important. Yeah, you guys should all have a link on your MCPS, my MCPS classroom page. It's a little purple square, if I did it correctly, and it should have showed up sometime this afternoon because that's actually when I remembered to hit the publish button. More things will pop up, but right now this is all part of session 1, topics 1, 2, and 3. I got really creative with the naming 1, 2, and 3. I'm very proud. So after you do the diagnosis, the piece on differential diagnosis, there are some other things on a playlist there that kind of talk about this idea of misdiagnosis and misdiagnosis. So the idea of the misdiagnosis is really when we ascribe one thing to another thing, right? That's pretty cut and dry. But what it really looks like frequently, like my example earlier with our African-American boys, the frequency with which we ascribe to some of the behaviors and what we see as problematic behaviors, and we diagnose as an emotional disability or a behavior problem. And if we've done a little more exploring, what we might actually find is a really, really gifted kid who is not being given the opportunity to show his giftedness. And so he is acting out. And because of whether it's racial bias or setting or whatever is going on, we're misdiagnosing the issue as, instead of maybe being an anxious gifted kid, we're looking at somebody who is more of a, or we're describing him as more of a behavior problem. So that's the case of the misdiagnosis. The misdiagnosis piece is, that goes a lot of those masking things where because one is hiding the other, we don't think to look for anything else. We're going to see that, I think, a lot more when we talk about those kids who are, like, the giftedness is masking this disability. Usually when we find those kids, we're talking like kind of late middle school, early high school, even into college, because they've been able to mask for so long and then they kind of fall apart. And it's because we missed that they needed different types of support, and they've just kind of been trucking along until they can't truck along anymore. There is a real, it is not often this works out for me. Look what I have right here on my thing, the book I'm about to talk about. This is one of my favorite books. I recommend it to our psychologist a lot, Monica. It's called Misdiagnosis and Dual Diagnosis of Gifted Children and Adults. What I really like about this book, and I will tell you, I never read books in order. I read them in the order of interest to me. So what I really like in this is that you can pick up any diagnoses, okay, within the realm of what we typically see with gifted children and adults. And what it will go through it for you is, what does the disability look like? What does the gifted counterpart look like? And when might we be able to tell that it's both or one or the other? And I like how it really lays out. And a lot of what it breaks down is when a behavior becomes maladaptive. One thing I talk about when we talk about perfectionism is there is such a thing as healthy perfectionism. And then there's maladaptive perfectionism. So healthy perfectionism is wanting to be our best, pushing ourselves to be the best we can be. Maladaptive perfectionism is when we are pushing ourselves to the point that maybe we don't have a social life, or we don't start things to begin with, or we purposefully tank ourselves, or we spend so much time creating the beautiful square behind me that you don't see the rest of my office because it's terrible. But I'm creating this setting of what looks organized and gorgeous because that's my little perfect bubble right there. That's Zoom, but in real life that can become a maladaptive behavior. And so that's a lot of what we talk about with this idea of misdiagnosis is, when are we calling it the wrong thing? When are we missing something? And when are we just not understanding? And when it comes to this idea of giftedness, and especially now that we're really understanding that gifted brains are different than typical brains, are we miscuing what giftedness is and instead calling it something it's not? So that's kind of what that section is. Again, I would say my school counselors and psychologists, you guys, I think will really find a lot of interest in these articles. For our classroom teachers, I would say definitely, like I said, watch the first or listen to the first podcast and then pick like one other thing on here, unless it's something that sounds super interesting to you. But since it's a lot on identification and you guys don't deal as much with identification, I don't expect you to necessarily go down the identification rabbit hole. The other thing, we have 8:40. So I have one more thing I'm going to touch on tonight. You know, we have a lot in here about neurodiversity, and neurodiversity really, like I said earlier, is talking about like the difference in it's talking about how brains can be different. So we talk about neurotypical, which is more of like that average brain. And then we talk about a neurodiverse brain. So that can be a combination of anything. That can be a gifted brain. It can be an ADHD brain. It can be an autistic brain. It can be a schizophrenic brain. The brains just, they function differently. They look differently. When they do some of these MRI things, you can see actual differences. And over time, you can see how they physically develop differently than typical brains do. So that is the entire world of neurodiversity in like 3 sentences. There's a lot more out there. There's actually a whole graduate school that does nothing but talk about cognitive diversity and neurodiversity. But in 3 sentences, that's what you're going to get. And I do have on here the reframing giftedness and disabilities piece. And I really am excited, like I said, because I put that out there a couple of years ago, and now like actual researchers are showing that it's a real thing. So I'm just kind of full of myself and excited right now. The other piece that I'm going to talk about is the section, and it's called Topic 3, Identification Beyond the District. It's a terrible title. Ignore the title of the thing. Just go with Topic 3. I have a Supreme Court decision in there for you guys to look at. It is a summary that I wrote for my administrative law class. I'm not a lawyer, just so you know. Don't pretend this is anything legal. This is like me summarizing for teachers what the Andrew F. case was about. And really, what it comes down to is the Supreme Court redefined what it meant to make progress for special education students. The child in this case is not a twice exceptional child, but most of the stuff around him really applies to twice exceptional. And so it was a really important landmark case, especially for those of us in twice exceptional land. The other things on there, which are currently labeled Supreme Court decisions, but they actually should be labeled as Dear Colleague letters. It's a series of letters. So there's a whole thing in government where, like, when one office writes to another office to give their opinion on something, it's called a Dear Colleague letter. So this is a series of Dear Colleague letters that have been written from the Office of Civil Rights to the Office of, or to the Department of Education. And again, you don't need to necessarily dig into these. Like the first one I have on there on Guide to Students with ADHD is 42 pages. Please do not read all 40. I'm not telling you to read all 42 pages. I'm putting it there as a reference so that when you have questions, it's a place to go back and refer to, because on page, I think it's like 26 or something, there is a whole little couple sentences that say, you know, people might believe that students who, because they have needs because of their ADHD, would not be appropriate for gifted services and programs, but this is not accurate. And then it goes a little bit from there. So it's part of that whole like kind of federal picture of the legality of the work that we do. Twice exceptional often falls into a little bit of a gray space because our kids may or may not have IEPs or 504s. They still can be twice exceptional and have all these twice exceptional needs, but they're not covered under IDEA. And gifted is often a dirty word around the world. It's highly misunderstood. We've lost all of our federal funding at this point. We used to have like the Javits funding has been eliminated at this point in time, which is the money that was coming from the federal government to support anything to do with gifted. So it's important to know what federal pieces are out there to support the work that we do. I also put one in there. It's on access for students with disabilities. That was the big one that came out in 2007 that said, just because a kid has an IEP doesn't mean they can't take AP and IB classes. It feels very straightforward to me, but as I mentioned in the beginning with Scott Barry Kaufman, where his IQ score was too low to take the course and his teachers recommended him for the courses, and he was not allowed to take them because of the IQ scores. So that is something that has been addressed. Now, how it's addressed in the classroom, that's a whole different conversation. We'll come back to that on, I think it's week or session 5. But it is out there in the world of federal. There's something on here on the Title VI access to AP courses that's more about students with disabilities. But again, I wanted to kind of give you guys a package of information. The other, it's government, so new is 2015, right? The other one in here is the guidance to ensure access for English language learners. It says high quality education, but it does include language about accessing advanced courses. So yeah, so the screen that's on is called topic 3. It's not fancy or pretty. And like I said, the whole list of Dear Colleague letters that says Supreme Court decisions, those are not Supreme Court decisions. I will fix that. This is why I need people to edit for me. But again, I would take a look at those, get yourself a little bit familiar. The 2007 letter is only a page and a half, so definitely read that. It doesn't take a lot of time. And the other ones really to me are just kind of references. And then if you are a parent or you have ADHD yourself, those first 2 ones, especially the rights for students with ADHD, I think is an important one to have. I wish they would write something out there on autism explicitly. They haven't done that yet. And I don't get paid enough to do those things. So we'll just put a hope and a prayer out to the universe. So I'm going to wrap us up for there because I do know that we want to talk a little bit about the final assignment. I did throw an article into our chat earlier today. I've mentioned a couple of times the Matt Zareski article. I will also put that into the topic 3 section. Again, it won't be pretty, but I'll put it in there so you guys can access it. And I just really like what he's talking about. And I think it does a really good job of setting us up, especially as we go into the social emotional section, which is not for another 2 sessions. But I think it's good context as we move forward. We will be having a guest speaker we're not meeting on the 4th of July, no meeting on Thursday. So next time we meet will be next Tuesday. And we will have a guest speaker, Dr. Claire Lynch Hughes. She actually founded and runs the Twice Exceptional Teacher Education Program out of Cleveland State University. She's also the president of CEC TAG, and is in the process of publishing a book on how to teach teachers to teach twice exceptional kids. It's not teaching twice exceptional teachers, although most of us who are in our classes are twice exceptional. That's just a coincidence. That's the whole thing I'm working on. One of the really good opportunities, and this does actually lead me into that final assignment that Hannah's going to talk us through in a minute. One of the opportunities that we do have, what is designing a lesson plan using the model that Claire is currently researching. She's looking for examples of it, and then also during the school year, if you could actually teach and follow the format and provide feedback, awesome. But she's actually looking for examples of lesson plans that follow her lesson planning format called Trellis and Bloom. And so you writing a lesson plan, anything that we do that follows those plans, I do share with Claire, because she's looking for teachers to actually try it out, because it's a new theory that she's postulated. Is that the right word? I think it's the right word. Awesome, thank you. And so any chance that we have to kind of test that theory for her is super helpful. And we can go over that, definitely. Claire will go over that when she talks to us next week. But otherwise, Hannah, do you want to pull up a very messy thing called final assignment?
So we have not published this yet. So this is just a sneak peek. But your final assignment is going to be application. And we wanted to make this relevant to multiple roles. So the first thing after all these different options that we have provided you with are 2 example student profiles. So both of these are profiles for twice exceptional children. They each have their strengths and their needs. And if you are a teacher, you can choose the option to write a lesson based on how you would support this child and use strength-based instruction in your classroom. We also have an option here for a psychologist for how you would implement an executive functioning plan for this child. Leave it up on the screen so you can check it out for a minute.
And while Hannah's showing that, I also want to throw out there, because I think I have one on there called Option Infinity. We are putting out these examples because some people are concrete and they want me to tell them what to do. And then I have some folks who, oh, I took Option Infinity off, darn. It was there for a while. I have other folks who come to me and they're like, this is what I really want to do. That's fine. As long as it touches on what we're talking about in class, you do you. But if you want me to tell you something specific, or you want us to give you something specific, that's kind of the point of these options in here.
You are, in your leadership on ILT at your school, staff development, CS, EACE, you can create a resource for teachers in your school to learn about twice exceptionality, develop a PD for them. This is the one I did when I took this course. We are working on updating MCPS's handbook on twice exceptionality. If you are interested in doing that and working on the team, let Sarah know. Sarah, do you still have that spot open for the 10-month employee?
I do have, sorry, that was so weird. I did update it and I don't know, Canvas sucks. At this point, I have some people who have applied for it, but if it is something that you are interested in being paid to do, it's a 90-hour position to basically to deep dive with us and help us write the updated handbook. For the class option, it's not 90 hours, but if you want to look at a section in the handbook and either, give us some updated references or outline what you think a section should be that we don't currently have, it's only a couple hours that you would put into it. That would be a fine option to do as part of option 10. And what we've been doing is, when people have done that option, is taking the outlines that they have provided us and that we're using that to write our chapters. So it doesn't go to nowhere. But if you are, feeling really into this and you want to commit 90 hours over the next year and you really like research and writing, I do have one position open still that we are interviewing for next week, I'm going to say. That sounds accurate. And if you're watching the recording, I can't promise it's still there.
I skipped over administrator and central office. Whoops, my bad. So for administration, you're thinking about a particular student. and you are finding resources for the team that supports that student. So the counselor, the teacher, the special educator, and explaining why you have chosen those. Is this 10-month employees only or 12-month eligible to apply?
12 months should talk to me.
And then over here, which we have not linked anything yet, but we will at some point, relative giftedness refers to exceptionality within a population that is not typically considered to be intellectually gifted. So for example, a student who is relatively gifted and has Down syndrome, or another impairment that would lead them into a program such as LFI, CB, or for ALO, so that that child would receive a lot more support than a typically developing child would. Even with more severe and profound disabilities, there can still be relative giftedness. So we will flesh out this option a little bit more, but if you are working in LFI, if you work with children who are on alternate learning outcomes, that might be something you're interested in exploring.
Yeah, the lessons that or the pieces that we've done with that so far, I had quite a few folks from those programs last semester, and what they ended up doing was an extensive profile on the student, and then talking about the instruction they did around those specific strengths. So for example, we had students who their IQ scores were in the 50s, maybe 60s, but then they had a maybe one of their scores was up in the 80s. So again, it was a 40-point spread, but it was a 40-point spread on an area that we're not typically, but that meant that that student had such strength in that area that they didn't really mesh with their peers in that particular topic. And so what could the teachers do to address that relative giftedness and advancement in the classroom and really help that child shine in terms of that relative giftedness piece. And another one that's sort of related, that we do have some kids. I actually, when I looked at Hannah's numbers earlier, I actually have a student right now who's almost the exact reverse, like his verbal score is in about the 80s or so, but his visual spatial is a 152. Like, what do you do with that? And the child's in second grade. You know, there's a lot of just kind of interesting things to kind of think your way through. How do we work with that? How do we really hone in on where those specific areas of giftedness are and help expand and develop strength-based options for that child? Yeah, Christy, I'm 100% on that. I just actually promised Hannah I would actually publish the course before we started class tonight, but I will get back to you. So yeah, we're just about done. On the homepage, I do have a link. So if you ever wanted to make an appointment to talk to me, ask questions, there's a link on there, and that gives you access to my calendar, and you can make an assignment. My child wants to come say hello to you all. Yeah. Can you tell we're related? I'll be downstairs in a minute. Okay. Okay, give me a second to finish. I'm almost done. I think that's all for now. The only last thing is I always turn off the recording for about 5 minutes, and people can ask questions that they don't want to ask when I'm recording. So for those watching the recording, good night. Make an appointment if you need to talk to me. Otherwise,